It is a special privilege for me to give this lecture at the beginning of the series which Dr. Kinlaw will offer. It's also terribly frightening. As I have told many of you students many times, all my original thoughts come from either Dennis Kinlaw or C.S. Lewis. So what I have to say to you today, at least in its gestational form, all came from him. He will surely hear himself, I hope, coming back in what I say today. I owe him much more than I can ever repay. How shall a Christian form his or her sexual ethic? This is a burning question in the church today. It is spawned by the sexual revolution, which was in turn spawned by the development of the contraceptive pill and the legalization of abortion on demand. These two things together have given the illusion that sexual activity can now be engaged in without, without fear of unwanted results. That is, conception of a child and its subsequent birth. The net result has been to reduce sex to a recreational activity on a plane with any other recreational activity. But that has produced some other results, largely unforeseen. One of those is the trivialization of sex. Removed from the mystery and wonder and responsibility of conception and birth, it turns out sex is really rather oversold. It's like a drug. The more you get, the more you want. And somehow there's never enough. Where once the question was, do you kiss on the first date? Now the question is, do you have sex on the first date? We hear of 12 and 13-year-olds practicing safe sex on each other. Operative language, on each other, by which is meant oral sex. Far from the deeply suggestive idea in the Hebrew Bible that to have sex with another is to know them, sex today is simply a matter of using another. The other person is simply a means to an end, the end of selfish pleasure, which is an insatiable master. But there have been other unplanned results of this unplugging of sexuality from conception and birth. One of those results is the removal of any argument against homosexuality from nature. If sex is merely recreational, who is to say with whom or with what one takes one's recreation? So, the male and female bodies are uniquely complementary for the purpose of conception. So what? My body is mine to do with as I choose, and there is nothing that can stand between me and my choice. Of course, the nature issue has become marvelously one-sided in this argument. Whereas one could never appeal to nature to say that man is clearly intended for woman, when a homosexual says that he or she is biologically conditioned by nature to be what they are, the argument becomes irrefutable. Thus, one could only oppose such activity because one fears or hates homosexuals. The idea that there could possibly be a rational or moral argument against this behavior is simply inadmissible. That has been said loudly enough and repeatedly enough until people have begun to believe it. Nietzsche has been proven right. Language is power. So what's the Christian to do? The answer ought to be simple. For 2,000 years, Christians have appealed to the Bible for their moral and ethical guidelines. If you want to know what to do or how to live, look to the Bible. It's a word from God revealing His intentions for life and practice. But if Christians have used it that way, they have unfortunately used it in another way. We have also used the Bible to provide a divine warrant for what we wanted to do in the first place. Too often it has been used in this way to justify prejudice and self-serving. We can only hang our heads in embarrassment and shame at the ways in which the Bible has been used to justify human slavery or the subjugation of women, to name two. But these tragic failures cannot justify the wholesale abandonment of the Bible as a moral guide, as our opponents would like to see happen. At stake here is the nature of the Bible itself. If the Bible is merely a randomly collected amalgam of the literature of Jewish and early Christian communities, which collection process, extending across a millennium or so, intentionally obscured the actual formation of those communities, then there is indeed good reason to abandon it. At best, it would be a deeply flawed witness to where we've come from as a Christian community. To look upon it as a source of direction for moral choice would not only be wrong, it would be ludicrous. But that's not an accurate description of the Bible's origins. And the reason I say this is because of the Bible's unique understanding of reality. Those who insist that the Bible is simply one more product of the evolution of human thought in the West Semitic milieu are forced to downplay the central defining features of biblical thought. How is it that among all the religious systems of the ancient Near East, the Bible alone insists there is one God, not many? That the world is the intentional creation of a one personal creator and not an effusion from the body of watery chaos? That the creator is distinct from his creation, not a part of it, not an expression of it. That magical ritual is forbidden rather than being the fundamental understanding of the relationship between human and divine. That God is suprasexual, not sexual at the deepest level of his being. That God is primarily to be known within the context of human history and not in timeless myth, etc., etc. In short, this Old Testament religion, which is supposedly simply one more expression of West Semitic religion, contradicts West Semitic religion at every important point. How are we to explain this? Our opponents respond by insisting that the differences are only that. Differences. After all, whether it's one God or many, they still believe in gods. Likewise, whether the sacrifices are thought to be magically effective or not, the Hebrews still practiced sacrifice just like everybody else. The issue is, where did these supposedly insignificant differences come from? Particularly since the Hebrews are the only ones who hold them. Surely if all the ancient Near Eastern religions evolved along the same lines, from the same original concepts, it's more than a little strange that only one of them should go in a radically different direction at every significant point. In short, even if we say the differences are not an argument that Hebrew religion is unique, we still must account for the existence of those differences, and accident will not do. As we all know, when the Hebrews are asked where their different, that is to say, unique religious ideas come from, they're quick to answer. And the answer is God. They're equally quick to depict themselves as remarkably unresponsive to God's attempts to communicate reality to them. This in itself is remarkable. Can you imagine the Greeks telling us that when it comes to logical, philosophical reasoning, they are complete dunderheads? Hardly. They tell us that they created philosophical thought because they're the most brilliant people in the world. Yet, the Israelites tell us again and again throughout their entire history that they doggedly resisted every idea that is now contained in their sacred writings. So if they resisted those ideas, denied them, fought against them, how did these ideas survive to get in the book? If the Hebrews didn't evolve them like everybody else, where did they come from? The answer is that certain faithful people, prophets they're called from Abraham onward, were inspired by God to say these things, and that the sweep of history proved them right again and again until even the most thick-headed, obstinate person had to admit they were right. Does that sound like evolution to you? It doesn't to me. It sounds like revelation. That the God who is not this world, but who has made this world with divine purpose, has found a way, despite concerted human opposition, to reveal the nature and the meaning of life from within the very context of that life. So what does that mean for our original question? It means we should indeed look to the Bible to see what a Christian sexual ethic should look like. When we do that, we discover that God has some very decided ideas about sexual ethics. But then another problem arises. Clearly, there is that in the Bible which was incumbent on certain people for a certain time, but is not incumbent on all people for all time. We need look no farther than the sacrificial system. That system was solemnly enjoined upon the Israelites at Sinai, and they violated it on pain of death. It was God's word. Yet, no Christian today practices any of that sacrificial system, and we feel not the least qualm of guilt over our failure to do so. Why? Because we understand that sacrificial system to be symbolic of spiritual reality, which reality has now come in Jesus Christ. That's what John the Baptist meant when he said, "Behold the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world." And the Baptist's thought is then widely enlarged upon by the writer to the Hebrews. The sacrificial system was for Old Testament times, but not all time. Is not the same thing true for the Old Testament's system of sexual ethics then? The simple answer is no. Because directly opposite to the situation with the sacrificial system, the Old Testament requirements and injunctions concerning sexuality are reaffirmed in numerous and various ways throughout the New Testament. And we heard the Apostle Paul doing that in the scripture that was read from Ephesians. Far from releasing us from those injunctions, the New Testament underlines them. So having said all that, what does the Old Testament say about sexuality? And can we discern anything of why it says these things? I want to go to one of the strongest statements and use that as the basis for my observations. It's found in Leviticus. Now, the book of Leviticus is certainly not a favorite among Christian readers. Yet it's far more important to our faith than most of us realize. In the first 17 chapters, we see the gracious provision of atonement that's been made for us, so that we, fallible as we are, may yet live in the very center of God's holiness without that holiness destroying us. But why does God want us to live in the center of His holiness? The final chapters of the book, chapters 18 to 27, give the answer to that question, so that we can be holy as he is holy. Does that mean we're to share his transcendent essence? Those qualities of the numinous that Rudolf Otto talked about? No. To be holy as God is holy is to share that divine character that most truly expresses his holiness, a point Otto completely missed. You must be holy, for I am holy, is above all an ethical statement. Strikingly, then, the very first issue that God addresses in this second part of the book, the call to be holy, is sexuality. And the entire chapter 18 is given over to that issue. And as if that were not enough, just one chapter later, much of chapter 20 addresses the same points already made in chapter 18. Why is this? What's going on? Several mutually contradictory explanations have been offered. Two of these we may dismiss immediately. The first is, these were slaves coming out of the desert, and like all rural, uneducated people, were frightfully repressive, especially in matters of sexuality. The second, coming out of higher critical thought, argues that virtually all of Leviticus originated with the post-exilic priesthood, who, like their leader Ezra, were sexually repressed and insisted on obtruding themselves into the private lives of ordinary people. As to the first, it seems to me to be the voice of urban prejudice speaking. All rural people of all times and all places cannot be lumped together as sexually repressive. The second explanation must necessarily contradict the first, since now it's being said that the Leviticus proscriptions did not originate with a repressive rural culture, but from one that had been immersed in Babylonian culture, which was highly urbanized. However, it's like the first in that it's equally prejudicial. Who says that priests are necessarily sexually repressed, or that Ezra in particular was? In this argument, as in the former one, hard evidence in support of the assumptions is in singularly short supply. As to the Bible's sexual restrictions growing out of repression, I call upon us to take a long look at the so-called Song of Solomon, or as the Hebrews title it, the Song of Songs. If one reads that canonical book with any attention at all, especially in the Hebrew, the English has sort of expurgated it, it will become very clear that for the Israelites, sex within the boundaries of a committed heterosexual relationship was pretty much a no-holds-barred situation. Repression? Hardly. So what is going on? When we look at the text itself, novel thought, we find another explanation. The Israelites were forbidden to engage in any sort of sexual activity outside of heterosexual marriage because that is what the Canaanites do. But immediately the next question emerges. Was this not then merely a way of keeping the Israelites separate from the Canaanites? In this understanding, the Bible is not saying that these extramarital sexual activities are intrinsically wrong, but just that it was important in the early going, or was it in the post-exilic period, for Israel to maintain its distinctness from the surrounding people, if it was to retain its identity as the unique people of God. Thus, it is argued on another level, these prohibitions are time conditioned. They were for that time when the Israelites were in danger of being absorbed into the surrounding culture and ceasing to be the people through whom God could convey his love to the world. As an aside, I might ask, And is the church today not in such danger? But be that as it may, the question is that what the text is saying? That these behaviors are only forbidden because they are Canaanite, not because there's something intrinsically wrong about them. I don't see how a straightforward reading of the text could ever permit that understanding. These things are contrary to the nature of humanity as God made it. And because the Canaanites have insisted on practicing them, the land, the creation, is vomiting them out. That figure of speech is surely intentional. Why do we vomit? We do so to eject something from the gastric system that will be destructive to that system. That this is the correct reading of the data is supported by two repetitions in this list of prohibitions. These actions are seen as being unclean, and they are an abomination. What's the point here? That which is unclean is contrary to the nature of Yahweh. Isaiah knew himself to be unable to survive in the presence of the Holy One because his lips, representing his life, were unclean. The unclean cannot survive in the presence of the clean. The two conditions are mutually exclusive. Hands that are clean are not simultaneously unclean. But why do these behaviors, incest, bestiality, adultery, fornication, and homosexual practice, render us unclean in the presence of Yahweh? The answer is, they are contrary to life as God created it. That's the significance of that word abomination. We don't have the time here to go into an exhaustive study of that concept, but let me simply say that when we look at the occurrences of that word, we find it regularly used of unnatural actions that are detestable to the Creator. These are actions which in the most fundamental sense fly in the face of the universe as God designed it. But if this is true, if engaging in sexual activity outside the bounds of lifelong heterosexual marriage is a denial of the very thing God made us for, why is such activity so deeply tempting to us? Why does the Canaanite in all of us find it so attractive? So much so that it is the very first thing God addresses in his call to holy living. I think we begin to see the answer when we look at the first 9 verses and then the last verse of chapter 20. There, the sexual prohibitions found in verses 10 to 21 are fronted by a prohibition from offering one's children as a sacrifice to idols, and then by a prohibition from having anything to do with mediums and wizards. That latter point is then reinforced by the final verse in the chapter, verse 27, which says that anyone practicing wizardry must be put to death. Now, what is this encapsulation of the sexual prohibitions between idolatry and sorcery saying? I believe it is saying that for the Canaanites and for us, the unbridled expressions of sexuality are a religious statement. Their sexual activities and ours are a statement about their and our view of reality and an attempt to place themselves and ourselves in that reality. What is the Canaanite view? It was the standard ancient Near Eastern position which I touched on above. This psycho-socio-physical cosmos is all there is to reality. And a concomitant of that view is that everything in this world is continuous with everything else. That idea of continuity doesn't necessarily flow from the idea that this world is all there is, but it is necessitated by the need to control the cosmos that gave rise to that idea that this cosmos is all there is. Humans are profoundly needy beings. Apart from our physical needs, most of which we cannot supply for ourselves, there are a host of social and psychological needs. If those needs are not supplied, we will shrivel up and die. So how can we gain control over the cosmos to make it supply our needs? First of all, there cannot be anything beyond the cosmos, because that would be by definition outside of our control. And in the cosmos, there can be no boundaries between the realms of human nature and spirit. If I take this world to be all that there is, but yet admit that there is a boundary between me and the divine, between me and nature, then I have to further admit there is no way that I can ensure that my needs will be supplied. And that's not an acceptable alternative. The whole point of insisting that this world is all there is to render it susceptible to human control. And that requires the hypothesis of continuity. If the gods are fundamentally continuous with the visible world, we can understand them. They are an amalgam of human and nature, all that we are and it is, only written large. We have made the gods in our own image, in other words. As we are capable of goodness, so are they. But as we are incapable of sustained goodness, neither are they. As we are often dependable, so are they. But as we are incapable of sustained dependability, neither are they. As we are driven by the basic need of self-preservation at all costs, so are they. As we are obsessively sexual, so are they. As our sexuality is the most mysterious of all the drives, at the same time the most satisfying and the most frustrating, so in its unbridled expression, we are in touch with divinity. That's why the holy life begins with sexual prohibitions. What is bestiality about for the Canaanite? An expression of psychological aberration? Hardly. It's a way of affirming there's no boundary between human and nature. Or, in the light of that piece of Canaanite literature which describes Baal copulating with a cow, that there is no boundary between the gods and nature. By the same token, what is adultery about in that worldview? It is an affirmation that there is no boundary around any human relationship. Sexuality is so significant that it cannot be limited to one single relationship among two humans. Can the life force be contained in such narrow confines? Never. A female's fertility does not belong to her alone or to her husband. It belongs to the world. And what about homosexual activities? There are no boundaries whatsoever that can dictate how I express and participate in the life force within me. But it might be objected that by bringing in all these religious overtones, I'm making the whole thing a little overblown. I first encountered this objection some 40 years ago during the social upheavals that characterized the 1960s. I was teaching a Sunday school class, and in a lesson, aired some of my early opinions along these lines. One of the members of the class was a widow in her late 60s, very sharp and very crusty, and as kind as she was crusty. After class, she came up to me and fixed me with her eye. "Mr. Oswalt," she said, "you can't tell me that these boys and girls coupling in the streets are doing that in order to make some religious statement." I smiled and said, "No, Mrs. Johnson, I can't say that. But I can say this. They are denying, as forcefully as they know how, that there are any boundaries on their self-expression. No one is going to tell them how to use their sexuality. It is theirs to use as they wish." She nodded and said, "I'll go that far." So what is it about sexual self-expression that requires the imposition of these boundaries? Surely it is precisely because of the incredible importance of the sexual embrace for all that God is trying to do among us. Here, our entire personhood is caught up as in no other drive. Here, our hopes, our fears, our longings are all engaged. Here, as designed by God, we enter into the mystery of communion, surrender, and satisfaction as nowhere else in human experience. In the final analysis, our sexuality is designed to be a lived out parable of what we are made for in God. But the only way this experience can come near serving its divine purpose is if we will first admit that we do not define the terms of our existence, but that our Creator does. If we begin by insisting that we will use our gifts to supply our needs in our own way and for our own purposes, all is lost. There is a boundary between us and God that we recognize when we allow Him to define our real needs for us and to determine how those needs will be met. And it is in the surrender of our sexual self-expression to Him for His purposes in us that we most concretely and effectively recognize and admit that boundary. So sexual promiscuity of all sorts outside of lifelong heterosexual marriage is finally a religious statement. It is a way of saying, there are no boundaries which confine me. I am God in my life, and the world is mine to manipulate as I will. On the other hand, lifelong faithfulness to a sexually differentiated partner is also a religious statement. We recognize that we are not God, and neither is our mate. We no longer need to demand that he or she fulfill what only God can in our lives. We embody our acceptance of God's right to determine what is right and wrong in life. We discover the joy of complete humanity when two incomplete and yet complementary expressions of humanity come together in an utter self-surrender and self-forgetfulness made possible by absolute commitment. What is it to be holy as God is holy? It is to allow Him to lay down the terms of the human condition and to joyously conform to those terms. It is to lose yourself in absolute surrender to Him, confident of His complete commitment to you, and in so doing, to find yourself as you have never known yourself before. Is that worth building a high hedge around? You better believe it.